I do think that there's something about us quite often that's just broken. That, Father, we cry, give us faith, but then you challenge us to do things to give us faith, and we cower back. Help that not to be us today. Oh, but Father, that we would be an obedient children, that when you call us to do something, we do it, because that's how you give us faith. You give us faith by giving us experience with you. Help us to not let fear cause us to stay silent when you're telling us to speak. Help us not to allow fear to cause us to stay still when you're telling us to go, but that our faith would be bigger than our fear. That our faith in you would be bigger than all of the doubt and the things that would cause us to pull back. Help us, Father, to learn to be a little bit more obedient, to learn to be immediately obedient when you're telling us to do something. Father, I pray that you would just speak a word over our hearts today and help us to go deeper. In Jesus' name.
All right, y'all can be seated. Thank you, Pastor. Okay, so we are Set Apart Student Ministries. So our name has been given us vision to pursue to be a set apart student, right? Last week we talked about the mission that drives the vision. And so who remembers step 1 of living a life that is set apart? I'll give you an idea. It's A and A. Anybody remember? Both start with an A. You're close. Assess and, yes, assimilate. Good job, Luke. He was listening. So what does that mean? Does anybody know what assess and assimilate means? That's good. So it says to be honest and humble about where you are. And so we looked at the guy named Hezekiah and how he responded to the letter that the Assyrians had wrote him. And so he made sure that he was viewing things through God's perspective, and he acknowledged that the enemy was working in his life, and he was able to get an honest evaluation of where he was. And so there was an important truth that we talked about last week, and that was if anything at all, no matter what it is, gets in the way of you pursuing God the way you should, then it has to go. And so Pastor Dylan is going to come, and he has a message today, get ready, called Something Smells Like Poo.
All right. Something smells like poo. You ever smelled something that smelled like poo?
Yes.
Was it poo?
Lunches.
Was it poo?
All right, so I know you're like, what in the world? Where does that come from? I got a story to tell you. And what's funny is that I was very shocked that I have not told y'all this story before, because it's one of the best ones. So anyways, who has played like league sports, like track, soccer, anything, softball, football, cheer, anything? Okay? So league sports are great. You know, you meet, like for me on Saturdays for football, it's like you meet there on Saturday, you play, it's fun, it's great, right? It's great. But then when you get to middle school, what's different between league sports from the league in school is you actually get the opportunity to travel. You get the opportunity to like go on a bus after school and go to like another town or another place and play on a whole nother field. It's really cool. And I remember that football for me started in 7th grade. In school ball, I should say. We didn't get to play in 6th grade for school. We got to play league. But in 7th grade, school ball started, and our first school game, y'all are gonna love this story. Our first school game was 50 minutes away, not 15, 50 minutes away. Miss Amy's laughing because she's heard this story. 50 minutes away And so this is our first away game. I was pumped, right? I was pumped because I had never got to travel that far for a football game, okay? Now here's how it worked. The 7th graders played first. They had a game that was about an hour. And then the 8th graders played, and they had a game that was about an hour. Hour 15. So I'm in 7th grade, so we played first. And then after the game, what would happen is we would sit and we would watch the 8th graders. I don't know where this story's going, like I'm already laughing. We would sit and watch the 8th graders, okay? So I had a teammate, and I'm not going to call his name, but it started with a T and rhymed with Kristen. So we'll just go with that. Not that he'll ever watch this. I hope he watches. That'd be cool. He probably laughs about it today. Yeah. John. Right? So Tristan was a linebacker. Anyways, he was a linebacker. Okay. The linebackers hit people really, really hard. Okay. Now, one of the things that was cool is we got to go home before the game, and we got to go get food and come back to the game afterwards. It was really cool. And so we go play the game and all this, and then, man, we had a great football team. We won the game. Actually, Stone County was good. It was a close game, but we won. And then we watched the 8th graders play. And so we're watching the game, and man, I'm sitting in the stands, and I'm like, oh man, like what is? I don't know. I just, maybe there was a cat that pooed or something, So I smelled something. Anyways, I just smelled something just now. Anyways, I get back. We get back on the bus, right? We get back on the bus, and I'm like, man, that's that same smell, but it's like times 10, And everybody's like, what is that? You hear from the phone, like you hear all of them, what is that? What's that smell? What's going on? What is that? And I'm like, at this point, I'm just laughing, like somebody farted or something. I'm like, it's like, oh, you farted, right? I was like, I ain't no fart, man. Somebody like ran out of toilet paper or something. Like, I don't really know what's going on. Now listen, I started smelling this after the game, and we watched the whole 8th grade game, all right? I get back to the locker room, and at this point, I'm almost gagging, right? The whole team is trying to figure out, at this point, we know somebody pooed themselves, right? We know somebody pooed themselves. And I'm getting changed at the locker, right? My locker is here, and my teammate's locker is behind me. And kid you not, I look back, he's taking his football pants off, and I see brown gunk running down his leg.
It was poo.
Running down his leg. Our coach walks in and is like, what is that, right? Sees the dude with poo on his leg. He starts laughing with us, right? He's like, that's funny. I'm like, Tristan. Now, at this point in my life, I was kind of a bully, so like, I was looking for ways to pick on him, but that's beside the point. But I was like, Tristan, like, bro, when did this happen? He's like, I don't care. That's all he'd say, I don't care, right? I'm like, when did this happen, right? And it happened during the game. Like, I'm wondering, like, first hit, put yourself, you know what I'm saying? Like, Buddy done played the whole game, sat through the 8th grade game, rode 50 minutes on the bus, back home, didn't go to the bathroom when he got to the locker room, just decided to change right there with poo running down his leg. I'm like, dude, like, I'll be like, y'all know what this means? Y'all know what this means? That means take me out the game, right? Or at least like, okay, I'm gonna get through the game, and then, hey coach, before we watch the game, can I go to the bathroom? He could have went. Riding the bus, or man, I didn't feel like I could go when I got back when I was watching the game. Dude, go to the bathroom when we get to the locker room. Like you were setting yourself up. Here's what I learned that day. I learned this. Being made aware of something is not enough. When you are made aware of something, you then have to make the decision to do something about it, right? You then have to make the decision to do something about it. He could have pretended like it wasn't there, which is the only possible reason he would have done this. But guess what? It was still there, and everybody knows it, and we're talking about it almost 20 years later, 15 years later. Yeah, 15 years later, we're talking about it, right? So last week, Pastor Alysa was saying was all about assess and assimilate. What this means, for those of you that weren't here, we basically said we are set apart students. What that means is God is calling us to something greater. God is calling us to something better. He's calling us to be different than the normal customs and behaviors of the world. That's the vision we're trying to pursue. But mission drives vision. What we do is mission is what we do to get to the vision, right? And step one of the mission is to assess and assimilate. We have to be honest about where we're at. We have to be honest and true. Say, hey, I'm not exactly to the fullness of where I need to be, and I see that. And the way that we did that is we're saying, God, search me. Show me where I'm at. Show me the flaws. Show me the things that are stopping me. God doesn't point these things out to say, hey, you're terrible. You can't do this. You're not great. He doesn't do all that, but it's like, hey, I want you to be better. I'm going to make you into something new. But this area in your life, this is distracting you. And we said this one thing. If anything at all, no matter what it is stopping you from pursuing God the way that you should, it needs to go. But we have to be honest and let God talk to us about that. We don't need there to be anything stopping us. And I'm just going to say this. If you sat in this service last week and you are truly trying to pursue God, then you know what it is that's stopping you. I know God was speaking to you. It doesn't matter if you try to ignore it. It doesn't matter if you try to push it aside or justify it. There's no possible way you could have sat through this service last week and not been made aware of things stopping you. We're made aware though, right? We know what it is. And even if you weren't here last week, if you've been trying to pursue God, you know there's things in your life that are stopping you. But listen, it's not just enough to assess and assimilate. It's not just enough to be humble and honest about where we are. But then we have to battle the barriers. We have to battle the barriers. We assess and assimilate. We're honest about where we're at. God shows us, okay, I'm made aware of what's stopping me. Now, I want to battle the barriers. If there's anything we learned about my friend that pooed on himself, is that once you're made aware of something, you have to actively attack it, right? You have to actively attack it. So tonight, sermon in a sentence is this: battle the barriers. Battle the barriers. For those of you that like English, you're like, that's not a sentence. It's called an implied subject. The you is in parentheses. I remember that from 6th grade English. It is a sentence. Battle the barriers. You battle the barriers. Sorry, that just came to my mind. Genesis chapter 39. We're going to talk about Joseph. Now, you're here Sunday night. It is a coincidence that we're talking about Joseph Sunday night and Wednesday night. I wrote this long before I wrote that message. But we're not talking about Joseph's whole story. We're just going to talk about one specific instance. See, Joseph, let me tell you about Joseph. Joseph was somebody that was set apart. You remember last week, Hezekiah was somebody that was set apart. Well, Joseph was somebody that was set apart. God's hand was clearly on his life. Even in his own brothers and sisters, I don't even know if he had sisters, but even amongst his brothers, he was set apart. He was clearly Jacob's favorite. And God gave him dreams. God gave him all of these things, okay? So Joseph was set apart. But there's this moment in Joseph's life where he has to battle the barriers. If you remember, when you're set apart, at the same time that God's favor and anointing is upon you, a target is on your back as well. And it stinks sometimes that the enemy comes to try to attack us. And this is what happened to Joseph. Man, his brothers sold him into slavery. How bad? I know some of y'all don't get along with your brothers and sisters, but I don't think you would do that, you know? His brothers sold him into slavery. He was bought by a man named Potiphar. But Joseph was set apart. And what happened was Potiphar liked Joseph. He trusted Joseph, and he put Joseph in charge of the of his entire stuff. Okay, he said, you're in charge of everything, just, obviously don't touch my wife, right? Side note, just for those of you that like biblical nuggets, when you read a version of scripture, it says that Potiphar was a eunuch. If you know what that means, Potiphar was a eunuch. So his wife actually was probably like, I need something, right? I need something. Just as a little side note for you. Okay, so maybe that's why she's so straightforward. That was just a side note that has nothing to do with the story. But look at what happens In Genesis chapter 39, verses 6 through 12. Remember, Joseph is in charge of the entire place, and now we're going to read about what happened. So Potiphar gave Joseph complete administrative responsibilities over everything he owned. With Joseph there, he didn't worry about a thing except what kind of food to eat. Joseph was a very handsome and well-built young man, and Potiphar's wife soon began to look at him lustfully. "Come sleep with me," she demanded. But Joseph refused. "Look," he told her, my master trusts me with everything in his entire household. No one here has more authority than I do. He has held back nothing from me except you, but because you are his wife. How could I do such a wicked thing? It would be a great sin against God." She kept putting pressure on Joseph day after day, but he refused to sleep with her, and he kept out of her way as much as possible. One day, however, no one else was around. When he went in to do his work, she came and grabbed him by the cloak, demanding, Come on, sleep with me." Joseph tore himself away. "I'm getting out of here." But he left his cloak in her hand as he ran from the house. Man, this is what happened to Joseph. Joseph just minding his own business. All of a sudden, he feels that hand on the shoulder.
Oh, no.
She's like, "Come sleep with me." He's like, "I'm getting out of here. I don't know what you are," right? He's like, "I'm running," right? Now, Joseph was in a place where he clearly had to battle the barriers. It's obvious what his barriers were. God wanted him to do something. God wanted him to be somebody, right? And there was a clear barrier. A barrier meaning something stopping him from being and doing everything that God wanted him to be and do. He was clearly made aware of this barrier. She said, "Come sleep with me." I don't really know how else you can be more clear, right? Clearly made aware. And now he's forced to actively attack. I know what you're thinking, like, come on, Pastor Dylan, like, that's not even fair. Like, nobody's walking up to me and being like, "Hey, drink this beer," right? Like, come on, like, that's pretty direct. Things like that don't happen super direct to me. Like that's not even fair. And you may be right, but here's the truth. There are clear things that are stopping us from moving forward in our walk with God. And if you've been serving God, you know what these things are. And you have the same choice as Joseph. Are you going to actively attack it, or are you just simply going to be made aware of it and do nothing about it? Here's the good news. Joseph does 4 things that are really going to help us when we make the decision to battle our barriers. Now listen, you were made aware, and if you've been serving God, you probably have a good idea of things that are stopping you. Right? Things that are stopping you. And I'm hoping you're going to choose to follow Jesus and say, "Okay, I realize these are stopping me, and it's not going to be easy, but I want to say no to these things. I want to get away from these things, but I need help doing so." Well, luckily, Joseph gives us some help. Look at his response to Potiphar's wife after her direct proposition. He said, "Look," he told her, my master trusts me with everything in his entire household. No one here has more authority than I do. He has held back nothing from me except you because you are his wife. How could I do such a wicked thing? It would be a great sin against God." I know a lot of times when we're trying to battle our barriers, we come up with all of these strategies. Okay, if I just do this and focus on this, maybe then I can battle my barriers. But Joseph started with step 1. You want to battle your barriers? Learn to say no. Learn to say no. It seems so simple, right? Like, obviously, like, why is that even a point, Pastor Dylan? Like, learn to say no. I get that. But here's what happens. A lot of us, we can't get past the first step because we're so used to this barrier in the way that we can't really comprehend life without it. And so what happens is, we're so used to functioning with our barrier stopping us and we've been resisting God for so long that in our mind we've actually removed from our thought process the possibility of no being an answer. We've removed that from our thought process. And somewhere along the way, giving permission to these barriers stopped becoming a wrong decision and started becoming a normal function. But Joseph learned to say no. A lot of us, what would have happened in Joseph's situation, we would have been like, "Well, I've done everything else. I guess this is just God's will." No. Learn to say no. Let me remind you of a simple truth. If God has revealed something to you that's in the way, you are fully capable of saying no to it, and it's actually the expectation for you as a Christian that you're going to say no to it. That's your expectation, that you are going to say no to it. I remember one time I went up to Pastor. I was dealing with something. I'd been struggling with this thing, and I'm like, I want to get rid of this, and I'm a processor and a thinker, and I'm like, man, there's so much I'm trying to do, and I had all these plans and strategies. I was like, listen, I just got to go to Pastor and ask. And so I was just straight up with Pastor. I was like, listen, this is what I'm dealing with, this is what I'm going through, this is what I've tried, and I don't know what to do. You know what he said? He said, say no. Pastor, I came to you wanting some different strategy, help me out, give me wisdom beyond what I can understand. You've been doing this for 30 plus years, help me out. He's like, I know. Learn to say no. Because at the end of the day, it comes down to your decision of whether or not you want it in your life. At the end of the day, you can have all the strategies, and I'm all about strategies, and we're actually going to talk about some of those in a minute. I'm all about those things, right? But at the end of the day, it comes down to this. Do you want it in your life or do you not? Because if you don't, you'll say no. If you do, you won't. And that's what it comes down to. If you're allowing it to stick around, somewhere deep down, you want it there. And that's the bottom line. How would I know this? Because 1 Corinthians 10:13 says that temptations in your life are no different from what others experience. And God is faithful. He will not allow the temptation to be more than you can stand. When you are tempted, He will show you a way out so you can endure. If you really want to battle the barriers that are stopping you, you've got to learn to say no. You've got to learn to say no. But this is just the first step. Unfortunately, how many of you would love if the enemy tempted you, you said no, and that was it? That'd be great, huh? Man, okay, rocking and rolling. But look at what happened. Look at what Potiphar's wife did. Because he already told her no. She kept putting pressure on Joseph day after day. Man, that doesn't seem fair, right? That doesn't seem fair. But you can't just learn to say no. Step number 2 of how to battle the barriers is you have to learn to continue to say no. Good job. You have to learn to continue to say no. Listen, some of my biggest defeats spiritually, Gabe, were right after my biggest victories. Because what happens is, I'm like, I just got to say no. I just got to say no, right? And then I get all the strength, I get all the stuff, I get all of this, let me just say no. And yes, I said no, yes. And then it feels like I took everything I had to say no, and I'm weak. And I'm like, I don't know if I can say no again. And then I fall. Listen, I've said this before, and this is still true. Victory isn't one thing, and then you're undefeated. It's a bunch of little things constantly repeated. What does this mean? It means you can't just say no one time and think that you've won the war. You have to continue to learn to say no. Now that seems like a big ask, right? Not only do I got to say no, Abby, but I got to continue to say no. That's not fair, right? God, isn't one no to the things in the way enough? Why is this so hard? I have to say no every time. How in the world did Joseph do that? Look at what the scripture says. It says, but he refused to sleep with her and kept out of her way as much as possible. See, a lot of times we think other people's situations are easier than ours, right? It's easy for them to continue to say no because they're not going through what I've gone through, right? We think their situation's a lot harder than ours. But you know what I learned by this phrase right here? He refused to sleep with her and kept out of her way as much as possible. Here's what I learned. Potiphar's wife was fine. That's what I learned. She's beautiful, right? That's a good-looking girl. How do I know that? Because if he wasn't tempted, he wouldn't have to stay out the way. Right? Guys are made to like what they see. We're made that... Oh, beautiful, right? And if Joseph wasn't tempted, he wouldn't have had to stay out the way. So obviously, Joseph liked what he saw, right? So you can imagine this guy who has a terrible life, and this beautiful woman walks up and is like, here I am, I'm all yours. Joseph's probably like, I got to get out of here, right? Like, because if it wasn't a temptation, he would have just stayed where he was at, and it wouldn't have been that big of a deal. See, we try to make other people's situation look easier than ours to try to justify our lack of self-control. The reality is we don't have self-control, but, their situation's easier. We try to make ours look harder than it is because we're trying to hide the fact that we really don't have self-control. And I'm not just talking about sexual sin here, okay? I'm talking about any sin that we deal with. We were honest and humble last week. We had to be honest and humble about where we're at. And Joseph obviously recognized that this was a problem. So what did he do? He removed himself from the temptation. Here's what I would argue. I would argue the reason a lot of times it's hard for us to continue to say no to the temptation is not because we're scared of letting go of the temptation. It's because we're scared of removing ourselves from the context of the situation. I know that's confusing, so let me explain. What do I mean? Let's say God says, hey, these friends are stopping you from pursuing me like you should. God doesn't just mean stop being friends with those people, but what he means is stop going where those friends go, stop doing what those friends do. If God says, hey, you need to break up with that person because they're stopping you from going forward, God doesn't mean you can still be friends with them. God means, hey, for now, you probably need to remove them from your life for this season anyways. See, we try to get as close as we possibly can to yes and still say no. If God says, hey, you need to stop watching pornography, he doesn't just mean stop watching pornography, but he means stop getting on your phone late at night. He means delete that app. Stop hanging around those people that have more revealed than they have concealed. Right? We got to remove ourselves from the context. Here's our tendency. We want to say no, but stay as close to yes as we possibly can. And here's what I find a lot of times. If you're not actually running towards sin, we have a tendency to at least linger in its presence. Yeah, I'm not moving towards it, but I still want to look at it, right? But you need to learn to continue to say no to your barriers. Don't just say no to your barriers, but remove yourself from the context of the barriers like Joseph did. Page 7 of 10, point number 4. Here we go. But then we have one final step to do. See, Joseph was in a place where there was nothing he could do. He did everything he could to remove himself, but the enemy had a sneak attack on him. You ever feel like, man, I'm doing everything I need to, and the enemy just comes out of nowhere with a sneak attack? You ever felt like that? Like, man, I'm doing everything I need to. Joseph's in this situation. It says one day, however, no one else was around when he went in to do his work. He's just doing what he's supposed to do, minding his own business. And she came and grabbed him by the cloak, demanding, come on, sleep with me. But Joseph tore himself away, and he left his cloak in her hand as he ran from the house. A lot of times we follow the steps, right? I've learned to say no. I've learned to continue to say no. I've removed myself from the context, but for whatever reason, I find myself continuing to fall. I've been there. I've been in those places where it feels like, man, I've done everything that I need to do. I've done everything. I've said no. I've learned to continue to say no. I'm not hanging around the things that cause me to do that. Why is it that I keep failing? Why is it that I keep falling short? Because here's what happens. See, Joseph ran and left his cloak behind, but the problem is when many of us get to the place after we get out of the room, we feel the need to go back and get the cloak. I forgot something. And we put ourselves right back in the situation that we were in before. We feel like we gotta go back and get the cloak. We can remove ourselves from the barrier, but we struggle sometimes detaching ourselves from the things attached to the barrier. But if you're gonna really battle the barriers, here's what you gotta do. You gotta detach from the attachments. You gotta detach from the attachments. Here's what I mean. When you're really battling the barriers, you may lose some friendships or relationships. You may lose your Snapchat streak, right? You may lose various things. You may lose your ranking in Fortnite. When you're really battling the barriers, there's going to be things that we lose. See, here's what happens is, God, I'm going to serve you, and I'm gonna love you, God. I know you want me to take this season. Sometimes it's not even stepping away. God's just calling us to fast for a season. He's like, hey, fast from this game, right? Fast from hanging out with this person. It's like we find some kind of way where we can still linger and hold on to the attachment. Like, I know I'm not supposed to talk to this person right now, but God, I need to ask them about a question on a test, right? And they're the only ones I can ask. Or I know you don't want me to play this game, but I've got like a super high kill streak, and I just want to maintain that. Or I'm just gonna post to this person to keep our streak, but I'm not gonna do anything else, right? Listen, some things are not gonna come with you. You've got to detach from the attachments. A lot of times we say, I'm going to leave everything behind, but we go back and get what we had there before. And I know, actually, like, man, this is hard, right? This is hard. Listen, it's like I've said from the start. Set apart living, there's a higher accountability. There is. The calling is greater. The standard is higher. It's on you, though. I don't believe anyone in this room is called to be a basic Christian. I believe God has called you to be set apart because you have the abilities and the skills and the talents and the anointing to change the world. But you have to step into that. But when we see our barriers for what they are, it changes everything. Look at what Joseph said. When she asked him to sleep with him, I can imagine his flesh was like, this would be fun. This would be exciting. This would be great. But listen to his mindset change. He said, how could I do such a wicked thing? It would be a great sin against God. Joseph remembered what the act actually was. It was great wickedness against God. See, oftentimes we call our sin by another name. Oh, my hostility and temper, that's just self-expression. Right? Oh, my pride, that's just my self-esteem. Oh, my gluttony, oh, that's the good life. Oh, my covetousness, oh, I'm just trying to get ahead. My perversion, oh, that's just an alternative lifestyle. My adultery, oh, I'm just simply meeting my needs. We call sin by another name, but Joseph saw it for what it was. It was wickedness and it was sin against God. But listen, don't make the mistake of hearing this entire message and thinking that being set apart is about all the things you don't do. It's not what being set apart is about. Being set apart is about living the absolute best life that God intended for you to live. See, the enemy wants to twist your mind, and he wants you to think that his ripping apart is actually the setting apart, and he wants you to think that God's setting apart is actually the ripping part. So when God starts setting us apart, he lies to us and says, God's taking your freedom away. There's so much more, there's so much you can't do. God's trying to rip you apart. And when the enemy's ripping apart, he whispers lies like, look at all the fun you're having. You can do what you want. I'm the one setting you apart. But we have to be careful, and I've said from the start, we cannot confuse the enemy's ripping apart with God's setting apart. We cannot confuse them. And so, I know this seems tough, and I know this is difficult, and I know it's like, man, like, being set apart is not easy, exactly. A lot of times we want the greatness. A lot of times we want the great things that come with being set apart, but we don't want to do what it takes to get there. But listen, after we assess and assimilate, and after we're honest and humble about where we're at, and then we battle the barriers and we say, I'm going to actively attack the things that are getting in the way. You know what we get to do next? We get to cultivate the connection. We get to cultivate the connection. And so next week, we're going to go into small groups and just talk about these past 3 messages, and then we're going to go into talking about what it means to cultivate the connection. But as we get to this last part, you can start that, Raylan. As we get to this last part, I'm going to put this challenge on you again. And I'm just going to say this. There's a lot of distractions in this room right now. I have no idea why, but there's a lot of distractions in this room. But I want to encourage you just for the next few moments to just focus in. Focus in on where you're at with God. Here's what we have to do to battle our barriers. We've got to learn to say no, learn to continue to say no, remove yourself from the context of the barriers, and detach from the attachments. Last week, some of you said, listen, I'm being honest about where I'm at. I see where I'm at, and I get where I'm at, and I understand where I'm at. Some of you wanted to resist it, And I get that. It can be scary sometimes. And some of us want to justify, like, no, this isn't what God's speaking, or no, this isn't in the way. But the reality is, you know what's in the way. You know what's stopping you. You know what's putting you short of where you need to be with God. And I'm not going to pretend like you don't know what it is. I'm not going to pretend like God is constantly knocking. God is constantly speaking. God's constantly trying to pull us to a better place with where we need to be. He's constantly trying to do that. And so there's no doubt in my mind, if you're truly trying to serve God, that God is speaking to you. He's trying to tell you where you're at. He is. And if you're not hearing that, you've probably been resisting it, or you've not gotten to a place spiritually where you've taken it seriously enough to hear God's voice. But it's not like you have to be at a certain spot to hear God's voice. That's not what I'm saying. But what happens is God pulls on our heart and tells us where we're at. You know what's stopping you. But now here's the next step. Do something about it. I would rather not know what's stopping me than to know what's stopping me and not do anything about it. Because it's aggravating. It's aggravating when I know something's stopping me and I'm not doing something about it. Because I know how that ends. I know it ends. I'm either going to serve God and do something about it, or I'm going to walk away. And of course, we choose to do something about it. So I know this is tough, and I know there's that little extra pull on some of you tonight. And God's trying to pull you to do something about it. And we just want to pray with you. I'm going to invite our leaders up here to get ready to pray. Now you can resist for the next 15, 20 minutes. God's pulling your heart, and that's on you. You can do that, and that's on you. But I'm not saying tonight when you come and pray that everything goes away and the choices are easier and everything's great. It's going to be difficult. I'm not going to lie to you. It's going to be hard. But what we do is we agree in prayer, we confess and say, hey, this is where I'm at, because it brings accountability, someone to hold us to that standard rather than ourselves when we don't feel like it. But if you need prayer for any one of these things, you just need prayer. Hey, I just got to learn to say no. We want to pray with you. If you're like, hey, I've learned to say no, but I'm just struggling continuing to say no, we want to pray with you. Some of you, like, you've learned to say no, you're continuing to say no, but you just can't remove yourself from the context. Like, the context is what I still want to be with those friends. I still want to go do those things. I'm not really sinning. I'm just kind of hanging around it. We want to pray with you. Some of you have some things, some attachment to the barriers that you need to let go of tonight.